All right, so Russia's red lines have been crossed, and we knew that already. Let's listen.
On, not just incidental, but things that are very important. And that is the potential for the escalation of the war in Russia, Ukraine, which could all too easily go nuclear, which we need to pay attention to. And there's also things in East Asia, which are not on hardly anybody's radar, but should be, because according to our guest today, that may be more important than all of these other issues. And we're going to get to both of those with our good friend, Professor John Mearsheimer, International Relations Theorist, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, and sage, if I can just say it, on all things foreign policy. Welcome back to the show, John.
Glad to be here, Danny.
Well, listen, let's jump right into it because we got a lot of things to cover here. I want to start off by looking at the situation in Russia, Ukraine from an American perspective, because as a reminder, President Trump from 2023 had campaigned relentlessly that he was going to end the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. He said it relentlessly, and then I think you know what happened once he came in there. That has transitioned from I'm going to end this in 24 hours to Marco Rubio declaring this.
We remain ready to play any role we can in that context of bringing a peace about, because we think the war in Ukraine, devastating war, has no military solution. It can only be solved through a diplomatic route, and it's been unfruitful. I would characterize it as the ongoing challenges. That said, let's be clear, we are not, to be fair and to be frank, we are not impartial mediators in that war. Okay, we don't provide weapons to Russia. We only provide weapons to Ukraine.
Yeah, I like Rubio less and less as time goes on.
We don't impose sanctions on Ukraine. We only impose sanctions on Russia. So we have clearly taken a side. We continue to sell weapons to Ukraine, by the way, through the Pearl program, unimpeded by what's happened in the Middle East or anywhere else. And look, we'd love to see that come to a negotiated settlement. As of right now, the prospects don't look great.
So what the hell, man? How do we go from I'm going to end this in 24 hours to we picked a side and it's the Ukraine side? Where is that going?
Well, first of all, Rubio is campaigning for the presidency in 2028.
He has no shot.
And he understands that inside the foreign policy establishment, what you want to do is be hawkish on Ukraine. That will win you the most support. And his principal opponent, of course, is Vance. And Vance has taken the opposite argument.
He has no shot either. Everyone in this administration is going down because of Iran.
Vance has been much more of a restrainer when it comes to Ukraine than Rubio. And by the way, you see the difference between the two of them with regard to the Iran war as well. Vance is in a position where he's trying to shut the war down and work out a deal with the Iranians. And Rubio is running around making it clear that there are fundamental differences between the administration's views and Iran's views, especially regarding toll booths or a toll booth in the Strait of Hormuz, and that may be a reason that we cannot reach a final settlement. So you just want to keep in mind the game that Rubio is playing here. With regard to what's going on, in the West, we have this new narrative that the tide has turned in the favor of Russia to come to the bargaining table, to come to the negotiating table and work out a deal to settle the war. So you don't hear Rubio or others in the administration saying that we have to defeat Russia.
They've given up on that short-term goal.
This is not the same approach that we took early in the war when we were talking about actually knocking the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. You don't see that rhetoric anymore. The argument that Rubio is making is that we have to settle this war. It can't be settled on the battlefield. It has to be settled diplomatically. But the only way you can get the Russians to reach some sort of diplomatic bargain, some sort of agreement, is to inflict significant pain on them, both on the battlefield.
It won't work.
And with this drone and missile campaign that's aimed at targets deep inside of Russia. So that's essentially what's going on here. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether you think the tide has really turned, that the Russians are losing this war, and that the Russians are just going to sit there and allow Ukraine and the West operating together to inflict significant.
They won't, but when exactly they will decide to strike back, I'm afraid Putin is going to wait till the West actually does some real damage to the Russian economy before finally growing a backbone.
Punishment on Russia.
And so the question is going to be, is that going to succeed? Because if that doesn't succeed, then all that does is leave you with this never-ending war, which President Trump allegedly says is something he was against, although I guess his words really carry no weight anymore. How do you see that?
Well, let's distinguish, Danny, between what's happening on the battlefield and what's happening in terms of this bombing campaign against Mother Russia. I think with regard to what's happening on the battlefield, the Russians are actually winning. Everything I read tells me that they're on the move, and they're well on their way to taking control of all of the Donbass.
They will have all of Donbass before year's end.
And this should be accomplished by the end of the summer, if not the early fall. I see no evidence that the Ukrainians are reversing the situation on the ground. So I don't know what people are talking about there. And if you read all the articles that are written on this subject carefully, there's no evidence in those articles that the Ukrainians have turned the tide. So this brings us to the whole question of the campaign of the bombing campaign deep into Russia with mainly drones, but also some missiles. And the question is, can the West and Ukraine working together inflict significant punishment on Russia and cause Russia to come to the negotiating table and cut a deal that's actually quite favorable to Ukraine? Is that possible? And there's no question that the Russians understand the game that the West is playing here, right? They understand that the West is cooperating big time with Ukraine.
Yeah, it's not Ukraine attacking deep into Russia. It's Europe attacking deep into Russia.
And that if anything, the West and Ukraine intend to escalate this air campaign, this drone campaign against Mother Russia. And the situation.
And it's apparently confirmed now that there was gasoline basically in these drones, so they'd make a big fiery explosion. Some of the drones Ukraine is using against Russia, deep into Russia, they're to do damage. Some of the drones, like the one shot at Moscow, are meant to make big explosions. This was one that was made to make a big explosion.
Situation is only going to get worse with the passage of time. Now, of course, people like Rubio think that this will bring the Russians to the negotiating table. It will get them to throw up their hands. I don't think that's going to happen. First of all, you want to talk about what Putin's reaction is to all of this.
Part of war is optics. Another part of war is the actual fighting.
It's quite clear from recent comments that he's made that he believes that the West is at war with Russia. He thinks that the West is out to defeat Russia. And he, of course, is not going to allow that to happen. So the question that is then raised is, what does Putin do? And I believe that there is lots of evidence that the Russians are preparing themselves to strike military targets in Europe with conventional weapons. And if that doesn't work, they will use nuclear weapons. Now, Putin, of course, has not said this, but Sergei
Others have.
Karaganov has famously made this argument in the West. And if you read the Russian media carefully,
He said that some countries in Europe should cease to exist.
there are all sorts of people inside of Russia who agree with Karaganov that it's time for the Russians to take off the gloves. Look,
And it's sad. It's because of corrupt global elites in Europe that might get a lot of their... in addition to inundating their countries with immigrants, they're going to get a lot of their citizens killed by provoking Russia.
the perspective from Moscow goes, it's the West plus Ukraine that is responsible for these attacks on the Russian homeland. It's not just Ukraine. Ukraine could not do this by itself. It's the West. And that includes President Trump. Indeed, the Kiev Independent, a major newspaper inside of Kiev, just had a big story that said that President Trump has basically sanctioned this bombing campaign.
That's why I said that Trump internationally is a disaster this second term. I mean, whoever's advising him, they're deep state.
That Ukraine is engaged in. And in fact, the Kiev Independent was saying it's not just the Europeans plus the Ukrainians against the Russians. It's the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans against the Russians. President Trump is back on the side of the Ukrainians. Given this situation, the Russians understand that they have to do something to respond. Because again, the Ukrainians and the Europeans, not so much the Americans on this issue, have promised further escalation. And by the way, one could interpret Marco Rubio's comments to indicate that the Americans are committed to further escalation. Regardless, the Russians think the situation's only going to get worse. And then you want to ask yourself, do you think the Russians are going to surrender or not? I don't think that's going to happen. I think that Sergei Karaganov's logic is going to apply, and that at some point in the not too distant future, the Russians are likely to attack targets in Europe.
I've said it. I think at some point this year, Russia is going to strike an EU state.
And this makes the situation surrounding the Ukraine war, in my opinion, really dangerous. Because I don't think that most people in the West, certainly most people in the foreign policy establishment, take the Russian threat seriously. And by the way, this is Karaganov's argument. Karaganov's argument is that Russia has been unable to establish red lines with the West. The West believes, and Ukraine believes, that they can slap the Russians around and the Russians will not respond. They will not do anything like attack targets in Europe. And Karaganov's argument, which I believe increasing numbers of Russians believe, is that what Russia has to do is it has to make it clear that there are red lines. It has to establish a deterrent. It has to put an end.
Every time Europe has escalated against Russia so far, that means like when there were drone strikes on Russian energy infrastructure last year, you know what Russia does? It hits Ukraine harder. It starts going after all the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. This year, the drone attacks intensifying to Russia. Russia hits Ukraine harder, going after Kiev. So it's like Europe attacks Russia, and then Russia punches Ukraine. And Ukraine is just a launching platform. Attacking Ukraine does nothing. Yeah, so Europe sees this and think, oh, we can just attack Russia as much as we want, and it's Ukraine that gets punched. It is no deterrence whatsoever what Russia is doing.
To these attacks on Mother Russia. And there's only one way to do that, and that's to attack targets in Europe. First with conventional weapons, and if that doesn't work, then turn to nuclear weapons.
Yeah, it's hard to believe we're even having this conversation today, and I can assure you, I can confirm exactly what you said from both the U.S. and Russian side. There are those there are those. Most everybody in America and in Europe, and we're going to see some evidence of this in a second, do not believe that Russia has any red lines and that they would ever cross that line. They believe that the Article 5 piece of paper that says attack on one is attack on all is like a get out of jail free card. And
what Russia should do, if I was really Russia, and right now if I was Putin, I would play Europe's game, which is pushing the red lines again. I would take somewhere in the Baltic states, somewhere like an American would care about, the absolute least, and I'd pick a completely valid target, like a factory that everyone knows is involved in making drones for Ukraine, and then I'd just bomb that one factory heavily and destroy it. And then I'd establish a red line, and then Trump has to decide whether he wants to go to war for a factory making drones in Lithuania, drones for Ukraine. That was, a valid military target as far as Russia was concerned. And I think Trump will go, fuck no, I'm not doing Article 5 over Lithuania. Because if you just attack one target, if you start to attack a lot of targets, it gets complicated. The media can spin that in different ways. But if you just attack one target, very hard. Oh, and I'd also warn them ahead of time so that this factory, the civilians could be evacuated and no one dies. Yes, because it has to be as painful a decision as possible, Trump. Does Trump want to do Article 5 for a destroyed factory in Lithuania where no civilians died? What do you think Trump would do in that case? Do you think he would honor Article 5 in that situation? Hell no. And so then Russia will have done to NATO what NATO has been doing to Russia, which is breach one of NATO's really big lines, which is you attack NATO, it's Article 5. Well, now he's established if you attack somewhere in NATO, maybe it's not Article 5. Then I would destroy a factory in Germany that's making drones after if Trump doesn't do war. But if the drone attacks continue, I would then attack a factory in Germany that's making the drones. And again, give warning ahead of time so there's no civilian deaths. And again, make it so that, Trump doesn't want to get involved with this. If empty factories, it establishes the principle that Russia can just bomb factories making drones as long as they give advance warning and no civilian casualties. And that's my approach, how I would escalate things without leading to World War III.
Russia would therefore never attempt to do that. So they do think that we can do anything. And I have seen also from some Russian sources just in the last 24 hours that confirm also what you said, that they believe that they're mad at President Putin. In fact, they say we should have done something much harder, some of these earlier things where the red lines were crossed, and then we wouldn't be in this situation today. But now then they say it's better late than never, but we, quote, have to take this action. Now, obviously, that's not Vladimir Putin. He did not return to my call, so I don't know what he's thinking. I'll just point out. But I know that a lot more on the Russian side are thinking that. So now then the question is going to be, what are we going to do about it? I've talked to you a little bit about the U.S. side here. Now let's go to the European side, and it's going to get a little bit uglier. Here's one that's more embarrassing than it is ugly, but it also is that. This is Mark Rutte in the White House just lathering up on President Trump and playing up to all of his arrogance and all of his love for praise.
The Trump trillion shows you the increase Europeans and Canadians are paying into defense since you took office in 2017. Right. Trump 45 plus Trump 47. The total of extra spend by the Europeans and the Canadians of 1.2 trillion. When you look at the effect of Trump 47, so the isolated effect of the extra defense spending in 2025 and in 2026, You see almost $140 billion extra spent nominal on defense by the Europeans and the Canadians, and also this
My eyes are glazing over. This means nothing to me.
year you will again see an increase
Just random numbers on charts that I can't read anything on.
by about 120 billion, which brings a total in 2 years of over $250 billion. I can assure you, this is because of Russia, because of the threat, but I'm also absolutely convinced that you being president
So basically, we're spending more on military because Russia threat.
of the United States, being consistently pushing for something which since Eisenhower has not been achieved, which is the Europeans equalizing their defense spending with the United States.
You know, I was thinking more in the Eisenhower, the warning about the military-industrial complex, which was on graphic display there. You might want to have added that. Do you think that this is going to move President Trump to go further down the path we saw Rubio talking about of supporting Ukraine?
I think it might. I think, Danny, and these issues are very complicated.
I think it might too, because if nothing else, the second term has showed us that Trump can be manipulated fairly easily towards deep state goals internationally.
At this point in time because so many different conflicts are at play. But I think if you look at what's happening in Iran, President Trump is being forced to make huge concessions to the Iranians. And
John is right here. He's absolutely right. Trump is losing Iran, and so he wants a victory somewhere else. That's why he's going after Cuba and Ukraine. With the way the drone attacks on Moscow, I think, oh, that's an easy victory. Let's just help Ukraine make more drones, and we could force Russia to surrender. We'll just create World War III.
And his critics, who are many inside the foreign policy establishment, are accusing him of being an appeaser, of giving in to the evil Iranians, for being weak, for being the equivalent of Neville Chamberlain. In that situation, I think Trump has a deep-seated interest in being portrayed as a tough guy on Ukraine so that he can compensate for the problems that he's facing because of the concessions he appears willing.
Yeah, and I think, of course, there's people in his administration that manipulate Trump, but Trump apparently watches 3 hours a day of Fox News. And I'll tell you, if I controlled Fox News and I knew the U.S. president watched 3 hours a day, I would manipulate the fucking hell out of that U.S. president using Fox News. Because you can just have, I want him to do something. I said, he's weak if he doesn't do that. He's weak if he doesn't do that. And I'd repeat that all day long. So he watches that for 3 hours and comes, yeah. You control the media, and if the media is consumed by the president on a daily basis, you're propagandizing the president every day.
To make on Iran. So I think that events in the Middle East are going to be of great importance for influencing how Trump thinks about dealing with Ukraine. And I think it's likely that Trump will play hardball with Russia on the Ukraine issue to compensate for his problems regarding Iran.
Well,
and it'll backfire on him just as spectacularly as the Iran situation will.
we'll certainly see how that's going to go. But this,
And that's why I want to grow as a content creator. Is when this breaks out, when Russia does hit the EU, I want to be around. I want to be able to put out videos saying, "This is EU's fault. These were the provocation to cause Russia to do this." It's not just Russia just suddenly becoming evil, deciding to attack Europe, which is how the media will portray it.
that can't be good because it's just not. I mean, you alluded to it there, but when you look at all of the ammunition and weapons we spent with Ukraine for 4.5 years, with Israel for 2.5 years, closing on 3 now, and then what we've expended here, and then what we're selling to other people around the world, we're in a dearth of ammunition and weapons. So maybe that's part of what they think about. They're going to ramp up defense spending. But John, look, that stuff could take years to actually replace that, and we're not anywhere near. Why are we even dithering around the corner of potentially spending more or sending more of our ammunition? Forget about the money. It's the actual ammunition is what matters. And if we keep sending it to Ukraine, that's going to dwindle our resources even more. Are you worried about that?
No, I think you're missing the key issue here, Danny. The key issue is the drone war against Russia. And all we have to do, and this is reasonably easy to do working with the Europeans, is help Ukraine build up an even bigger inventory of drones, an even more deadly inventory of drones, and then help provide them with the intelligence to employ those drones against target.
And this will work. like, for example, Alexei Mercouris is always poo-pooing the drone attacks. That's one of the commentators I watch there. And like the refinery that the drones hit in Moscow will apparently be up and running again next week, according to him. But the thing is, if there's another drone attack from Ukraine next week and hits that that refinery again, then it'll be offline for another week. And if it's with a drone after that, that means even if it's doing little damage, it is taking things offline for a while. And if you increase the number of drone attacks, you can, and you repeatedly target some facilities, you can basically permanently put them offline, even if you're inflicting a small amount of damage, because every time it needs to be repaired and shut down. So even just double or triple the current drone usage against Russia, and you could start crippling the Russian economy. The amount of parts available for repairs aren't endless. And if you start inflicting small amounts of damage all over the country at increasing paces, the people available to do the repairs become spread out and start falling behind. And eventually you start reaching breaking points. And that's what I'm worried. That's why I think Putin is stupid. Is he's waiting for that breaking point. He's waiting till the point where Russia actually starts being fucked and it actually starts impacting the lives of everyday Russians. And by that point, to try to do something to stop it, you deal with it now. You see it coming. Everyone in the world sees it coming. I see it coming. The amount of drone attacks from Ukraine are just going to keep increasing. They're going to start adding missiles to the mix. And eventually that's going to go way beyond Russia's ability to keep up with and defend against. So you shut that down now when you see the threat coming. You don't wait until you've lost several factories and you've been crippled.
Gets deep inside of Mother Russia. And that we can do. I think your points are applicable to what's happening on the battlefield. If you're interested in reversing events on the battlefield, then Danny Davis's rhetoric from a minute ago kicks in. But if you're focusing not on the battlefield, but you're focusing on the drone war, it's a very different story. And this is why the Russians understand that when the West and Ukraine promise that things are bad now, but they're going to get much worse with the passage of time, this is true. The West and Ukraine working together can make this drone war much more effective, much more deadly. Mm-hmm. And that is a huge problem for the Russians, who believe, quite correctly, that there are no red lines here.
Yep, there's no red lines. Putin has never enforced any fucking red lines. He just thinks attacking Ukraine harder accomplishes anything. Ukraine is already being sacrificed by Europe. They don't give a shit about it. So as long as they can keep sending drones deep into Russia.
I think Trump, any more than the Europeans, believe that the Russians will kick back if we continue to escalate our assistance to Ukraine in its waging of the drone war.
Okay, well, as it turns out, there's a couple of voices from Europe, and I think it was today, maybe it was yesterday when the video was actually made. Ursula von der Leyen seems to be completely backing up your contentions on this support for drones.
Ukraine's defense industry with Europe's support is showing that it can out-innovate Russia's. Ukraine now produces drones at a scale that matches and even exceeds Russian production capacity. And the determination of the Ukrainian people has shown to the world that their European choice cannot be broken. And now it is our task to turn that choice into a reality. Earlier this month, indeed, we opened the first cluster of negotiations with Ukraine, and this was a historic moment. A recognition of the remarkable progress Ukraine has made already, and a strong signal that Ukraine's future belongs in our European family.
Literally no discussion, and that was just one soundbite, but she makes no discussion at all about looking for a negotiated way to end the war unless, as she later describes, it's effectively a surrender of the Russian side to just give Ukraine what it wants, maybe along the line of contact. That's about as far as it'll go. But it sounds to me like they don't even want that. They just want this perpetual, open-ended thing of more military capacity for Ukraine going into Russia.
Exactly. I mean, everything that Ursula said reinforces the point that I was making. And what you want to do is put yourself in Vladimir Putin's shoes and think about how he views those comments. And needless to say, he believes.
Well, he believes, yeah, but he isn't doing anything about it yet. And he hasn't. Ukrainian drones started targeting Russian infrastructure last year. Again, the quantity of drones was small, so it wasn't a huge deal. But this year, it's been a flood, and it's doing actual damage. And what the fuck are you doing, Putin?
Believes, quite correctly, that Europe has basically declared war on Russia.
Yeah.
That's his worldview. And now what you and I are saying is that Trump is moving in that direction. That Trump, who once promised to shut this war down and looked like he was going to be a bosom buddy of Vladimir Putin, is, if anything, moving.
Trump is getting more deeply involved in Ukraine just so that he can lose there too and get a second loss on his record. Although Iran is going to finish him, so this is just be an additional nail in the coffin.
In the opposite direction. And I made the argument that that is definitely likely to happen because of events in Iran. But regardless, the fact is that from Putin's point of view, the Europeans have effectively declared war against Russia. And furthermore, as we've talked about, the Europeans and the Americans and the Ukrainians don't respect Russian red lines. So if you're in Putin's shoes, Danny, what do you do? What do you do?
We're going to hear from his mouth here in just a second, but one final piece there to really reinforce this a little bit more. We know, of course, that months ago, Germans sent an armored brigade into the Baltics as a forward deployed.
Speaking of red lines, Russia warned Kiev to get diplomats out, for the West to get diplomats out. They're going to hit Kiev very hard, and then they gave Kiev a light tap. Russia has no credibility on deterrence whatsoever, or its red lines. I mean, at least strike Kiev hard if you're not going to strike EU. But they can't even do that. It's a little sad.
Branch of NATO. They talk about how they're going to have the biggest land army in Europe, so they're trying to build up to that. And then we have the Chancellor Merz at that same conference added this.
Dear friends and colleagues, in these days we are seeing a new dynamic. The G7 summit, the European Council last week, and the E5 meeting in Berlin yesterday have sent strong signals of European and transatlantic unity and support for Ukraine. Ukraine and its brave people will prevail as a strong and sovereign nation and as a future member of the European family.
They will prevail. All the stuff that Ursula said, all the stuff that Germany's doing. I mean, again, I go back to what do you think, what you just asked about what is Russia going to think. But let me ask you that specific question on Germany. How much of this is rhetoric? Because we're also looking at how Russia's observing all of this, because they claim, many, Mark Rutte and some others, even in Germany and France, that we could be at war with Russia by 2029 or 2030. And so they're building.
It'll happen before that.
But can they really? Do you think that Germany actually has the military capacity, let's say by 2030, to act?
That's the thing. If they keep hitting Russia with the amount of drones they are, and they double, triple that, then 2 years of that, and Russia will be completely degraded in terms of military and industrial base. And then at that point, Russia will be as weak as Europe, and Europe actually has a chance. So, assuming Putin is a little bitch and never hits back, which that's what it's been so far, then actually Europe does have a path to win. Just hit Russia harder and harder and harder and harder in more cowardly ways, and assume they're never going to fight back, and then Europe has a way of winning. It's just a question of if Putin just is a little bitch for 2-3 more years, then Russia can lose. Yes, and it's been, I'd say, about a year now since Putin's been a little bitch in terms of never establishing its red lines. Before that, there wasn't anything really worth hitting back over. And let's see if Putin ever mans up or not.
Actually be a formidable military with ground force, air force, drones, missiles, etc., to actually threaten Russia.
No, but I don't think they're talking about threatening Russia with a conventional army. They don't have the World War II model in mind. Again, what they think is providing the magic formula is technology. It's drones. They think that they have discovered a way of getting at.
If Europe needs to, it will mobilize the Baltic states and same way they did Ukraine, conscripting everyone in it and just sending them off as cannon fodder against Russia. So it won't be the EU people. It's drones, and then, basically former Russian areas will be used as weapons against Russia.
At Russia that provides the West and Ukraine with a remarkable amount of coercive leverage. That's what's going on here. I think they fully understand that, first of all, they don't have the capability to rebuild the Wehrmacht if we're talking about Germany. And furthermore, if they do.
But they don't need to. All they need to do is to degrade Russia's military to the point where it's just as pathetic as Europe's.
Rebuild the Wehrmacht, it's kind of hard to imagine World War II all over again, because who in their right mind would want to do that, in addition to the fact that you're in a nuclear world. So that's not what's going to happen here. They see Ukraine as the frontline state. Right. And to the extent that the Europeans are going to engage the Russians militarily, they don't want to do it on German territory or Polish territory. They want to do it on Ukrainian territory. And they think the key is just to be able to hold on the battlefield. Right. Remember, I said the Russians are winning on the battlefield. There's no question in my mind about that, but they're winning slowly. And people in the West think that they can actually stymie the Russians on the battlefield so that the Russians can't even win slowly. And once you stymie the war on the battlefield, then you turn to the air war. You turn to using drones.
Yeah, they don't need to stop Russia entirely. They just need to keep Russia advances so slow that it takes them 3 years to get to Kiev. And by using drones to attack supply lines, they can slow Russia down. And yeah, if Russia doesn't get serious, if Russia keeps doing a limited operation, I don't see them reaching Kiev next 2 years if they don't put an end to the drones. The drones are impacting things on the front lines for Russia. Russia would be moving even faster without them.
Drones, and maybe eventually sophisticated cruise missiles as well. And you hit targets inside of Russia. That's the magic weapon that they're focusing on. This is what's giving Western leaders this false hope, and giving Ukrainian leaders as well this false hope that they can turn the tide and win the war.
And what is even in the mind of the West? I'm going to ask, this is kind of a two-part question. First of all, why do they think that using technology and drones and stuff is going to cause Russia to capitulate when it hasn't worked on Ukraine? Because they have been subject to tremendous amounts of long-range drones and the FPV drones and the fiber optic drones, you name it, and that hasn't caused them to capitulate, which is just a massive, massive years-long operation. Why do we think that a few more drones from the West is going to cause the much bigger?
Because Ukraine isn't a democracy. It doesn't have elections. The majority of people might hate Zelensky and want him dead, but it doesn't matter because it isn't a democracy. It's a U.S. puppet state. Russia, though, it is a democracy. It has to worry about what the people want, the will of the people.
For Russia to capitulate.
I make the same argument all the time. I mean, the historical record, even beyond the Russian campaign against Ukraine, supports your point. There's no question about it. The idea that drone attacks are going to bring the Russians to their knees. Furthermore, as you and I have emphasized from the beginning,
But they can. If you intensify them enough, they can. Don't try to... that drone attack may have only taken the refinery in Moscow offline for a week, but it did take it offline for a week. Just need to hit that same refinery with a drone every week, and you could keep it permanently offline.
Beginning of this war, from Russia's point of view, what's going on in Ukraine is of an existential nature. Right. This is an existential threat. And when the Europeans and the Americans basically ally themselves fully with Ukraine and make it look like they're going to integrate Ukraine into the Western security architecture, this, if anything, just increases Russian fear. And this is what gives Russia the incentive to think about employing the Sergei Karaganov strategy. That's what's going on here. I think what people in the West don't understand, Danny, is that if the West and Ukraine operating together are successful, that increases the likelihood of nuclear war.
It does.
The situation from Danny Davis's and John Mearsheimer's point of view is
that is entirely Putin's fault, because you establish your red lines a lot earlier than this. You strike factories making the drones, period. Give them warning, make sure no civilians dies, and you launch an Oreshnik at them and take them out. Even if it doesn't act, just your willingness to actually strike a factory in the EU making drones would send a message to make all the others reevaluate. It'll put an end to this drone nonsense. One Oreshnik with no one dying, and you could stop all this nonsense, Putin. But you don't do it because you're a little bitch.
Getting increasingly dangerous. We're scared. We're nervous. We think this is not going to have a happy ending. But you and I are at odds with most people in the national security community. They think that you can just slap the Russians around. You can ignore what they believe are red lines, the Russians believe are red lines, but are really not red lines, and get the Russians to capitulate at the negotiating table to Ukraine and the West's demands. That's the worldview here. And they think that, our concerns are just not justified. As you said before, they tend to think that the Article 5 guarantee that's embedded in NATO makes it impossible for.
To be fair, I think you're underselling the underground part of the equation. Yes, the desire to do a color revolution in Russia, the having forces do that. If there really was a way to do that, let me put it to you this way. The Iran war is not working out the way the deep state want. The Ukraine war isn't working out the deep state want. And deep state, I think it doesn't. I think this isn't a situation where they're gambling on Russia attacking Europe so they can escalate. I think this is a situation. What deep state actually wants is for Putin to keep being a little bitch for another 2 years, and so they can completely wreck the Russian economy. I think that is the deep state plan. And by not striking back, Putin is actually doing what the deep state wants. The deep state is fucked if it starts attacking Europe. Just like the Iran war went badly for it. So, yes, it does make nuclear war more likely, but doing nothing and letting Russians' military and manufacturing be decimated by drones increases the risk of nuclear war more than striking a factory now, in my opinion.
For Russia to retaliate with conventional weapons against a European country. Not going to happen because of the Article 5 guarantee.
Drones can literally be built anywhere. Not these more advanced drones, the big drones that go hundreds of miles. You sort of need a factory. You need big space for that. You need a warehouse. And Russia knows where that's happening. And just the fact of hitting a factory in Europe, other European countries will reevaluate the wisdom of having drone factories in their territory. And the ones in Ukraine, the reason there's no drone factories in Ukraine, what you just said about drones could be built literally anywhere. If that was true, they'd be built in Ukraine, just so that Ukraine could legitimately say these are Ukrainian drones. Problem is, all the drone factories in Ukraine were bombed out of existence by Russia. And so they couldn't make drones anymore. So even if drones could be made anywhere, it's Russia can still identify where it is and strike those locations.
And now you have all this transatlantic.
They'd have to start moving the factories all the way to Spain to keep them out of sight of Russia's range.
Solidarity. Just listen to that Merritt's speech. He was talking about transatlantic solidarity. He was not just talking about the Europeans and the Ukrainians. He was talking about the Americans as well. Indirectly, of course, but he was saying, in effect, that the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians are all operating on the same page. And we now have the magic formula, right? We found it. It's not so much on the battlefield. This was my point to you about.
But I think Resnick can reach. Yeah, maybe the Spain and Portugal only way that start being outside, but from Kaliningrad here, all of Europe, any factory anywhere in this part can be taken out. And if it's a factory in Spain, you can take that out from a ship or a submarine.
Don't focus on tanks and artillery. That's not the key. It's drones. And by the way, drones matter on the battlefield. Their view is that drones are the great equalizer on the battlefield, but they're really just the equalizer. Where the West and Ukraine win.
You were not talking about just a couple of dozen. We're talking about hundreds of drones. And when you're manufacturing hundreds, if not thousands of drones, that's impossible to hide the logistics of, or the place where they're coming from. It's just too big an operation.
Is in the attacks on Mother Russia. And there we've done a lot of damage already, Danny, but you want to understand that we can really up the ante here. We can give the Ukrainians a lot more drones. We can give them increasingly sophisticated and deadly drones. We can provide them with all sorts of intelligence, and there's no end to how much damage.
Just to give you an idea, some of the drones they have flying over the highway that they sent over the highway that was here, it has an AI in it, and first 80% battery power, as long as it has more than 20% left battery power, it'll look for military targets, the drones are sending in Ukraine. But once it's under 20%, it'll just find any target and crash into it. That's how you get the civilian deaths, like the buses that with the Belarus children in it that were destroyed, is because these drones, they try to identify military targets. If they don't find military target, when they're on 20% battery, they start looking for civilian targets. That's what Ukraine is using against Russia. I mean, it's pure war crime having that programming in the drones, and You think that if they triple or quadruple, if you have those type of drones going over all Russian highways and region, it's impossible to live like that. Russia has to stop the drones.
We could do in Russia, and that will cause them to throw up their hands. This is the narrative. And
Wow.
you, of course, believe that this is delusional. But
No, I think it's potentially suicidal because we're saying that we want the Russians to act like we never would, that just because of some line somewhere or something on a document on a piece of paper, that there might be some respect, that we're going to allow a foreign country, a nuclear power or an alliance to, with impunity, just keep hitting American factories and whatever else, and nothing's going to happen. Because to me,
It doesn't matter how powerful you are. If you're a superpower, if all of Europe, the resources of all of Europe are allowed to hit Russia endlessly without Russia ever striking back, Russia is going to go down. And you have to understand, a huge part of Russia's manufacturing and economy are in the area that Ukraine and the Baltic states can strike. They've got some stuff in the east, but it's a fraction, like right there. Most of it is here. Most of it is in this region that Ukraine and the West can hit. This is so like 70% maybe is in the region that Ukraine can hit. And if everything in here gets decimated, Russia is crippled.
that is just almost shoving Vladimir Putin into where, especially if what Ursula von der Leyen said and that they're actually going to do all this technology stuff to help more. Those factories have been named, by the way, by name by the Russians as targets. And it seems to me that we're just shoving Russia into a position to make them strike on these targets. And here, in fact, is what I said a minute ago, that we would let Vladimir Putin speak for himself. Here's what he recently had to say.
The potential for conflict has risen significantly in a number of regions around the world, including in Eurasia. We see that if earlier NATO countries limited themselves to supporting the Kiev regime, which came to power through illegal armed means and a coup d'etat, they are now openly saying in the West that they are preparing for war with us and are increasing their defense budgets. To justify this spending and the radical militarization of their states, NATO and European Union leaders continue, as before, to resort to false claims about an alleged military threat from Russia.
So, I mean, maybe you've already answered this question, but how much further do you think that Putin is going to allow these kinds of strikes to keep hitting his country at the biggest cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Voronezh, which apparently was an actual British Storm Shadow missile, so they've gone back to that. How much longer will he go before he actually does something like what you've described?
Yeah.
Let me make a couple points here. Just start by saying Dmitry Peskov just said recently, there was a big story in RT today about this, but Peskov said, and Peskov, for viewers who are not familiar with his name, he's Putin's principal spokesman, but Peskov said that Russia's only ace in the hole at this point in time is its nuclear deterrent. And I thought it was very interesting that Peskov was talking about the importance of Russia's nuclear deterrent, because I think in a very important way, he's basically saying that it's, and this of course gets at the Karaganov argument, it's the threat of using nuclear weapons or the actual use of nuclear weapons that probably is the only thing that can save the day for the Russians. So you just don't want to underestimate the extent to which the Russians understand that they are involved in mortal combat and that nuclear weapons are their ace in the hole. So we just want to keep that in mind. Now, with regard to Putin and how far he's willing to go, I think to some extent, Danny, a lot depends on what happens in the ground war. As I said to you, I think the Russians are clearly winning, and it looks like they're going to conquer all of the Donbass.
They are, but they're not going to. Let me put it this way: if judging by the speed they're moving and where Kiev is, by the time Russia reaches Kiev, that'll be like 2 years from now. Russia's military will have been severely degraded, and you can't afford to take 2 years of damage before reaching Kiev. By that, it might not even reach Kiev if it keeps on taking damage at current rate and supply lines are completely destroyed, which will happen if the drones intensify enough. Then it might actually be stalled. It has to stop the drones. Period.
They already have Lugansk, all of Lugansk, and they will, I believe, have all of Donetsk by either the end of the summer or the early fall. So they're doing well, but nevertheless, the progress is slow. There's just no question about that.
By the way, when I say they have stopped, I'm going on the assumption that drone strikes from Ukraine will double or triple in intensity. And that's where Russia starts being permanently degraded. At the current level, if it just stayed at the current level of drone attacks, I think Russia could manage. But double that, triple that, and no, then now you start having permanent damage.
And if you have progress that's slow on the battlefield, and this drone campaign continues to ramp up, that could put Putin in a position where he feels compelled to do something that involves attacking into Europe sooner rather than later. However, if all of a sudden the Russians started winning big time on the battlefield in the next month, that would probably have an effect on how Putin thinks about the drone war. He may be willing to not act in a decisive way quickly on that front. So I think what happens on the battlefield is interrelated, or is related to what happens in the drone war. The drone war and in the war on the battlefield, they're related to each other. But the bottom line here, and this is my final point, the bottom line is it's just very hard to tell. You're sort of in the dark here. And that's what, in my opinion, makes it all so scary.
To me, it's not complicated. Russia, although Russia is advancing, it's not advancing at the fast enough rate to. It'll be at least 2 years before it takes the rest of Ukraine, if things go on conventionally. And right now, you have a situation where you have all of Europe gearing up to make more and more and more drones. These are being sent not only from Ukraine, but also from the Baltic states, which makes it nearly impossible to defend against because you have this huge territory and they can attack anywhere. Also, you have U.S. intelligence to guide these around and avoid radar. Also, the drones are being equipped now with more and more AI so that they don't need to be controlled. They can like what they've been doing with the highway here, just patrolling the highway and targeting military vehicles and civilian vehicles. They could start doing those type of drones in this entire area. Imagine that completely shut down Russia's highway. Right now they don't have drones for it, but they give them 6 months and you might get to that point. And if you've waited to that point, Putin, you're a little bitch that's going to lose Russia because you're a little bitch. I'm sorry. Europe does have a clear path to victory. Devote all their energy to just use Ukraine as a launching platform and send drones and missiles deep into Russia on the assumption that Russia will never retaliate. And if that assumption proves true, Europe will win. So, how much damage Russia takes depends on whether Putin ever grows a backbone.
If you knew exactly where the red line was, then you can talk about marching up to the red line but not crossing it. But the point is, we don't know where Putin's red line is. It's quite clear from what Peskov said and from the clip that you played with Putin speaking that they are drawing a red line, that they are making it clear that enough is enough. But where exactly the red line is, it's hard to say. But it seems to me, just to repeat myself, we don't think there's a red line. We think we just push the Russians around.
Gary, I'm sorry, Gary, can I get you to scroll up a little bit on that so I can see a little bit more what's written underneath there? Because the phrasing you use here to me is really important. Nuclear deterrence only force preventing global war. That, to my interpretation, my ears, seems like it's kind of something that Karaganov has said, that is a way to prevent war, not that, because we've always think of that's like the last resort. That's like once we've got a big war, then it's going to go into nuclear and then everybody's, MAD and all that. But he seems to be implying here that is a nuclear deterrence and that they have to reestablish that, which sounds kind of like the Karaganov theory. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, he's not quite as clear as Karaganov is. So you have to read a bit into it as you're doing and as I'm doing. But I don't think there's a lot of daylight between him and Karaganov. And you want to remember that Karaganov says very clearly that when he first articulated his view early in the war about using conventional weapons first, then nuclear weapons second to establish red lines, that he was in a clear minority. That a lot of people thought that he was deranged in making this argument. He now says that an overwhelming majority of Russian individuals who he interacts with, people in the Russian foreign policy establishment, agree with him. And if you look at what Peskov said, if you look at what Putin said,
a lot of people in Russia are angry.
Medvedev, I think there's just lots of evidence that we are playing with fire here. And I just to go to the media for a second, what's amazing about what's going on with the American media is that the issue that you and I are talking about, which scares the living bejesus out of us, gets hardly any attention in the mainstream media.
Of course, because mainstream media exists to deceive the people, not to inform the people. Yeah. Well, I'm going to probably leave it there. We've covered the important points, which is I still believe Russia is going to attack Europe before the end of the year, because it's either Russia attacks Europe before the end of the year or Russia loses the war, as far as I'm concerned. Because if it doesn't attack by the end of the year, then it's never going to attack, and it won't just be drones, it'll be missiles. Maybe NATO start actually sending troops into Russia. You don't know. It will keep on escalating, because if Russia never enforces its red lines, it just means everyone's allowed to punch the fuck out of Russia, and Russia will never hit back. Do you think a country like that can win anything? No, it's just it should never have gone to this point. Putin having allowed this amount of drones. There are some drones that have been fired from Baltic states. EU drones from Baltic states through EU airspace into St. Petersburg. And that's a direct attack from Europe against Russia. And Putin hasn't enforced any red lines over that. I mean, he is a little bitch. Sorry to say it. Anyway, this will be on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kick or Twitch. And I'll see you next video. Bye.